Hello and welcome to the season finale of ESG Talk, your go-to source for insights and advice from leaders in environment, social, and governance. I am Ernest Anunciacion. So we are very excited to bring a super special episode to close out season 2. For the first time ever, all 4 ESG Talk hosts are here together for one final show. And so today we're going to reflect on some of the major milestones and events that have shaped ESG and sustainability over the past year, then offer up some of our predictions where we think this is going to head all in 2024. So Mandi, Steve, Andie, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for hosting.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Yeah, let's get straight into it. We can't talk about where ESG and sustainability are heading without first talking about where we are today. And 2023 has been a pretty transformative year, to say the least. And so I want to start with you, Mandi, if you don't mind kicking us off. As Workiva's Chief Sustainability Officer, what are some of the big moments that stick out to you the most coming from 2023?
Well, I think as we look back and more recently, thinking about the California legislation as looking at it to what's that impact to businesses as we continue to form, it's this idea that we talk a lot on the show about, like tax, where you're going to have different agreements by country that they may not all align to the same standards, and within states, how are you going to handle various regulations at the state level that might be same or similar or different from federal level. And so I think that part has been really interesting. And what that legislation did is it actually pushed more companies who are in the midsize, like Workiva, or more companies who maybe aren't public in the US but private, to really start to move forward faster. So they may have regulation, like Andie is so well aware with CSRD and other European regulations, but now they're seeing this collide of two regulations happening in the market. And their legal teams, their finance teams, their risk teams, and their sustainability teams, or even a voluntold person, are now having to accelerate getting ready faster because they realize what it's going to take to work across these different regulatory bodies.
Yeah, I mean, 2023, since I've been name checked, was obviously an incredibly exciting year for me because I've been sitting over here watching the EU get itself through the last few phases of the regulatory process for CSRD and its associated bits and bobs. So watching the market and sustainability teams sort of respond to what that means has been very, very interesting. And that's taken up, I think, for a lot of companies, there was kind of that moment in the middle of 2023 when the European sustainability standards were finalized and everybody started to go, oh, hang on a minute, this is when we maybe need to start thinking about work. I'm sure there's still a lot of work to do, but I think in many ways that has dominated the picture for 2023. There's been some other stuff happening, obviously. I mean, the UK has been active. There's a lot of talk about transition plans and zero and equivalent regulations and asset management, but CSRD has been a really big piece of the picture.
I think another thing that has really struck me for 2023 is the impact of the SEC's cybersecurity disclosure rule. I think it has a lot of ESG flavors to it. You think about the requirements of disclosing the process that companies would use to assess, identify, and manage material risks from cybersecurity, as well as how the board thinks about it and oversees it, and management's role and expertise in assessing and managing material cybersecurity risks. But there's a requirement in there that requires you to disclose cyber incidents within 4 days after determining that they're material. And that whole notion of material disclosure, I think, feels like a bit of a tipping point for financial reporting teams. Under existing SEC rules, you need to disclose material climate risks. If you think about the sample letter that was issued and a lot of the comment letters that have taken place over the last couple of years, that's been abundantly clear. You need to disclose material human capital factors. And now you have the cybersecurity risk, which is just one more example, again, a tipping point to me of a situation where financial reporting teams are going to have to be making materiality assessments for largely non-financial information. And that, I think, has become just one more example of the way teams have really need to come together. And I know it sounds a little bit odd, but I feel like cybersecurity was maybe that aha moment for a lot of financial reporting teams where they really, really needed to be paying attention and working a lot more closely with some of their non-financial counterparts, including ESG and sustainability teams, but also IT and risk teams as well. And to me, that really struck out as one of the big changes that I saw in 2023.
Yeah, 2023 wasn't without all of its fun. I mean, there's just been so much that's been going on. Andie, you mentioned everything that's happening in Europe, right? And sitting here across the pond and kind of watching it all unfold. And we're kind of waiting in the United States to see what the SEC comes out with their climate disclosure mandate. Mandi, you mentioned the California climate laws that are coming, maybe setting precedent for what we're going to see within the market. And then Steve with the SEC cybersecurity rule on materiality and the disclosures there. You mentioned very briefly generative AI, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring that up as something that really stuck out in my mind. You know, when I think about and talk with a number of our customers and podcast listeners for this episode specifically, you know, there's a little bit of fear in terms of the unknown with generative AI. And you know, I saw a really good quote out there that it's not Gen AI that's going to replace your job. It's folks who are leveraging Gen AI that's going to replace your job. And so, as we think about the application of that technology and how it can hopefully enhance the lives and the work that people are doing, you know, there's quite a bit of stuff that this might unlock. And so, you know, anytime there's new tech emerging like this, we heard it with robotics process automation how many years back? Well, are the robots going to replace our jobs, or big data like 20 years ago? Hopefully it's something that we can all kind of embrace and bring us into the next forefront here.
I saw a fantastic presentation. It was actually a really brilliant presentation on ethics and AI. But one of the things that it discussed was how the content that, for example, generative AI is able to develop is really strongly dependent on the quality of data that it has to work with, you know, whether that's structured data or unstructured data. And this was very much in the context of a discussion about how AI will be used to evaluate companies' sustainability performance. So I think there was a really, really strong message there that not only is the AI going to be an incredibly valuable tool on all sides of the fence, but that it's a really strong driver towards making sure that companies are fundamentally in control of what it is that they are putting out there for their sustainability data.
What has also struck me, to build on your point, Andie, is that, you know, for so many years we've heard about this digital transformation. Finance transformation is another term common within accounting and finance teams. Certainly, ESG teams are probably thinking about the same thing, although, you know, they might be playing a little bit of catch up's probably not the right word to describe it, but I'd say maybe accounting and finance is a little more fast forward in that process. However, to your point, the notion of leveraging generative AI, I think, has actually reignited those conversations about, okay, well, where is the data sitting and what exactly are we doing with it and how are we accessing it? That technology is only as good as the data that underlies it, which I think ironically gets us back to a conversation that we were probably having, I don't know, at least for the last 5 to 10 years. And it's been really interesting to see us maybe going back to basics in that respect. I think the other thing that's been interesting on Gen AI, at least that I have seen in conversations, is that audit, financial reporting teams, I can only assume ESG teams as well, are literally using that today in order to make their processes maybe a little more efficient, maybe fill in some gaps that they don't have from a headcount perspective, to do what I'd say maybe routine and certainly like no risk tasks of drafting disclosures or summarizing information or whatever. But that's actually happening like right now today. And I think it'll be super interesting to see how that continues outside and beyond 2023, of people literally using that technology like in the near term to fill some of the talent shortages and gaps that they have.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, Steve, and I would agree with you that I think Gen AI is opening a door for different types of transformation across groups. I think we're seeing even our own team here at Workiva using Gen AI to take the already assured and quality data that we have and then transferring that into Connect Articles, which is our internal site, employee communication site, and using or changing some language around in that way. So I think teams are finding fun, different ways where, again, they don't have staff or capacity to continue to build different types of stakeholder engagement and communication with the Gen AI tools that are available in market. Where I would maybe take a twist or think of things a little bit differently is sustainability teams have been on a transformative, innovative piece. And I can think of many of our CISO guests on ESG Talk where they really are working alongside the business to do innovation and technology and transformational projects that are relevant to the products of their business or are relevant to the long-term capacity of the business to survive a transition. I think of Nike and their hippie shoe that was on the show. And so I don't think that innovation is necessarily new to this market or different to a chief sustainability officer. In fact, I think they've been playing a very significant role over the last 2 to 3 years to keep and maintain and build a sustainability. Where I would agree with you, though, is the financial transformation side is what all groups are coming together as sustainable finance comes to the forefront, particularly across markets. And I know Andie and I have had lots of discussion around the notion of sustainable finance with some really incredible CFOs building sustainable finance teams or pulling together cross-functional teams focused on how these areas intersect.
Yeah, I mean, listening to presentations recently from sustainability officers explaining how they were pretty confident they were now getting the lowest possible cost of capital because of their work to identify the opportunities and the strategy changes to their strategy and their business model. And, some of those presentations are amazing. The comprehensive work that they have done on the entire structure of their organization is amazing. That isn't to say that there isn't quite a lot of the market for whom that this is still a very new exercise, and there are definitely a lot of companies sort of on that scale, going from I just need to get my head around these disclosures to I'm really aiming for that golden future that I'm seeing these amazing presentations on.
One of the other things I think is going to be interesting to see how it plays out is actually the G aspect of generative AI, which is that while I think it's been certainly productive and helpful for teams who are using it right now, I actually think the governance around Gen AI could end up being potentially catastrophic if people aren't using it in the right way. And I do think that that'll be interesting to see exactly how this technology ends up being used in the right ways and in productive ways, as opposed to maybe some of the destructive and risky ways that I think have been included in some of the headlines recently. Ernest, one of the things we haven't really covered a lot about is actually how are auditors thinking about ESG, and especially how are they thinking about it this year in 2023?
Yeah, as I've had conversations with a lot of our customers and practitioners and folks within my network, quite honestly, it's all over the board. It's almost reflective and indicative of how the market's thinking about it. On the one hand, you have a lot of CAEs who are kind of in the same wait and see mode, right? Until something's real and it hits their desk, they're not really paying any attention to it. But then you have a lot more forward thinking organizations who have been doing sustainability reporting for some time now and are already starting to insert themselves as part of that audit process, knowing that assurance is going to be a key element of the regulatory standard. So, and then you got everybody that's kind of in between. Now, putting on my CAE hat, I would much rather get ahead of this than wait and see, right? I look at ESG as another kind of risk pillar, the same way that we would look at financial risk and operational risk and reputational risk and credit risk, like, all these risks in the organization, because the fact of the matter is that's kind of where business is going. And so as investor mindsets and shareholders are kind of moving more towards that and wanting to see, disclosures around the non-financial reporting side of the house, anything that's publicly facing needs to be scrutinized and looked at multiple different ways so that we can confidently defend where those numbers are coming from. Because the last thing that I want to do is have any sort of misleading information out there. And my job as an internal auditor and as a chief audit executive is to serve as that third line of defense for the organization. And so if that means I got to, move up a little bit up the chain in terms of that defense there, I'm inserting myself and getting a seat at the table as we think about not only just the ESG strategy and what are the metrics and the topics that we want to disclose, what's right for our organization, but also the process and the programs of ensuring that, hey, we start off with our strategic objective. We have to identify the risks to meeting our ESG objectives, and then what are the right controls that we need to put in place. And I want to work very closely with folks like Mandi and Steve, like yourself, on the finance and accounting side, to just make sure that we've got proper people, proper structure, processes, and policies in place.
I think obviously the other big theme for me of 2023 has been the progress that we've finally seen crystallizing towards that golden interoperability of standards that people have been hoping for some time now. Obviously, that's not just been a 2023 action. There's been a lot going on overall. But this year, as well as the CSRD final standards, we had the release of ISSB's S1 and S2, catchily named standards. But that basically covers general sustainability disclosures and climate sustainability disclosures. And we're also still seeing a little bit of work towards more consolidation with the announcement that the work to monitor and maintain TCFD is also going to be handed over to the IFRS Foundation as well, starting from January 24. So there's a lot of exciting action happening on interoperability continuing.
Well, as fun as it has been to talk about and digest what has been a monumental year in 2023 for ESG and in other areas, here's the fun part. Let's all get out our crystal balls, and maybe, Andie, let's start with you. What trends do you foresee will be shaping ESG next year in 2024?
So 2024 is an interesting year, broadly speaking, because there are elections happening next year at the European Parliament. So that makes life a little bit uncertain. On the other hand, we do know quite a lot about things that will be happening in 2024 because obviously a lot of the work that started this year has an ongoing impact and will be carrying on straight into next year. So obviously I can't talk about this without mentioning CSRD because the CSRD work on the ground really gets going because January 2024, that is the start of the first financial year for the first companies in phase one of CSRD. That financial year, that all the data that they collect from then onwards, that starts to form that first report they have to do in 2025. So it's an amazingly exciting 2024, but also I imagine an incredibly busy one. We're also seeing the first review of sort of other regulations that have already been going for some time. That includes things like the sustainable finance disclosure requirements and the EU taxonomy. They're both now being reviewed, having been in process for a little while. And that includes all sorts of exciting questions, such as how do we align them with things like CSRD? How do we make sure that taxonomy is being looked at with appropriate levels of materiality? And it even includes questions on, should we maybe make some of this reporting more digital as well, so that everything is looking digital? We start to get the real details behind something that's not very talked about, but it's actually incredibly important, which is, and I'm sorry about all the acronyms, Europe does not do catchy names, European Single Access Point. ESAP doesn't sound great. However, it's massively important because one thing the European capital markets have not had until now is a central data access portal. And that central data access portal is going to be where investors and other users go to get the European sustainability reports. And finally, there is a bit of acknowledgement that companies maybe need a bit of help. It's a challenging environment. There's a lot of stuff going on in the macroeconomics. So there's also a big announcement from the European Commission to review reporting burden. And we see a lot in their 2024 work plan. This is incredibly broad. So this stretches well beyond sustainability burden into all types of reporting that corporations have to do to operate within a regulated system. But it does include a couple of little tweaks to help people get through things like CSRD. So they might delay, when the specific sectoral standards come in. But in general, that reduction in reporting burden is about helping in more other areas. So 2024 is going to be a little bit uncertain, still a lot of sustainability action, but also we've got some really good solid certainty on what companies need to do next for that CSRD reporting.
Well, among that certainty, hopefully these teams are going to block their calendars if they hope to go on holiday, because it sounds like they have a lot of work to do next year for sure.
Yeah, I think building on what Andie said, and Steve, a whole lot of work for next year. If I had a crystal ball looking into 2024, I think it will be interesting to watch as the first wave of Europe comes through and double materiality is on the table, because that really causes teams to dig deep and to think through what is the capital cost of doing these initiatives and material issues. What is the capital growth strategy? Like, let's say it's an opportunity strategy. If you look at Workiva as a tech company in this space, and then what's the impact on society? And I even think of our own practice in the economic value study that we did, right? What does the product actually do for stakeholders? What does your different initiatives do for stakeholders that are both inside and outside your company? And that exercise alone, as I talk to colleagues around the world, is very exciting because it's about the strategic positioning and support of your company. To Andie's earlier comment, the more progressive companies who are going first in the legislative wave have done a lot of work around sustainable finance. And I also see that, as Ernest and others come to the table, that's where there's this beautiful collide between our risk colleagues talking through what are the risks and opportunities to connect through double materiality. And as we think about finance, pulling into the financial metrics of the cost for capital growth or potentially the opportunity that the revenue can bring or whatever it might bring into the company. So as I look to next year, I'm excited to see the first wave of double materiality roll out.
Ernest, that's a great point on risk that Mandi brings up. Ernest, do you feel like 2024 is the year when the audit teams like really firmly are entrenched and embedded in these processes as these pending and looming deadlines and this really important work really needs to start taking shape?
It has to be, Steve, because businesses are trying to figure out how they leverage ESG, not only from a reporting standpoint, but just how do they derive additional value and using ESG as a way to gain competitive advantage in the market. If I look into my crystal ball, there are kind of three key topics that I think about from a risk perspective. And Mandi kind of touched on this a little bit. But the first one is I love this notion of green finance, right? This is a trend where we're seeing investors who increasingly are allocating capital to sustainable businesses, right? We want to see that, and we expect to see that to continue into next year as those investors continue to seek and align their investments with their own environmental and their own social values. The second area that I'm predicting is around the growth of having sustainable supply chains and value chains. Companies are becoming even more aware of the importance of having a very sustainable supply chain. We can see businesses today that are taking steps to reduce the impact to environment and social with the third parties that, whether it's a raw material provider or a service provider, right? They want to be associated with other companies that have similar values in terms of their ESG strategy. And then the third is around, Steve, as you mentioned, having auditors being part of this entire program, because we know that, there's this rise with the corporate sustainability reporting, whether it's going to be mandated or not. They're going to be asked by, if it isn't regulators, they're going to be asked by their investors to produce this information. So we can see a lot more businesses out there, if they're not doing it today, publishing those types of reports, providing that transparency as it pertains to the initiative that they're doing. So absolutely, the time is now. I wouldn't wait till next year.
Well, Ernest, I really appreciate that you brought up the fact that auditors are going to finally need to be entrenched in meaningful ways in these processes. One of the things that we get asked frequently is when is the SEC going to finally adopt the climate rule? I think that happens in 2024. I certainly think that with California adopting their legislation, or it being signed into law by the governor, rather, I think that impacts some of the analysis that the SEC needs to do. But I do think in 2024, we actually see a final rule. I do think that the financial statement footnote might look a little bit different. I do think that there may be some potential changes on scope 3. But I think ultimately where this leads is that in 2024, we're going to see a much deeper integration of ESG reporting, specifically climate, by accounting and finance teams in the United States, which hopefully gets them caught up a little bit to their European counterparts. Because I think that while leading organizations have done this already, I think that at least from the perspective of financial reporting teams, and again, mostly in the US, I think the reality has set in that climate reporting and ESG reporting broadly is not going away. And to the extent that you continue to operate in silos from your sustainability and ESG teams, you really do that at your own peril. I think the risks of noncompliance, to say nothing of the benefits of actually leaning into this in meaningful ways, as Mandi and Andie have brought up here, I think are just too big to ignore. So to me, I think 2024 is the year that we've seen that. That we see that particularly for those companies who may have been a little bit behind the curve in that regard. Mandi, I know that you pay a lot of attention to what is going on. Are there any big major moments that you're looking forward to in 2024 outside of what we've already covered?
Sure. Coming off of Climate Week and COP, I think those are really big, sobering moments for us as a society. So we can talk about the financial impact is one side of it and the regulation, and we kind of call 2025 the Super Bowl year, right? First wave is going through and reporting. You've got a second wave trying to figure out what to do, whether you're in the US, you're in Europe, or you're in the APEC region. But it's also 5 years until we meet the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And coming off of this past season, we're only 15% there towards the targets being on track. And so there's going to be, I think, as we turn the corner from this regulation Super Bowl moment, there's going to be a very sobering fact of the societal impact measurements not being on track. And what are businesses doing to contribute to that? How is their business proposition going to move forward, whether that's in their policies and practices, in governance in their supply chains, to ultimately some of their opportunities that they have to grow a business that has a sustainable future for all. So I think as we head through 2024, a lot of people are going to say, okay, regulation, yes, but we cannot forget about the overall progress we have to make in 5 years.
Something that I'm finding quite interesting is that obviously sustainability professionals and finance teams, and to some extent internal audit teams, are really heavily focused on complying with the CSRD. But every single one of those sustainability teams also really wants to make sure that they're still able to keep making impact. And I know they're really, really struggling to balance how to achieve good quality compliance with that need to make sure they are still able to continue making impact. And we're really seeing teams sort of starting to look at ways to improve efficiency, embrace technology, work out ways to tip that balance back the other way and make sure that all of these things continue on together, that they're not just complying, they are complying and still working on impact.
All right. Well, as we get ready to wrap up on our predictions for 2024, I actually feel like we should get back to generative AI. It seems like that is definitely not going to go away. I'm wondering if I could just ask each of you, what's one thing you think generative AI will impact significantly in 2024? And Andie, maybe we'll start with you.
Two things. I'm cheating. You can stop me if you think you can halfway between my two things. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so I think it will strongly impact, as I've already kind of said, focus on companies realizing that their data is going to be used by AI, and that doesn't just matter for investors taking a manual look. It means programmatically it all has to be great, and nobody's necessarily going to take a second look to check that before it goes into use. But also, more practically from the other side of the house, I think the really big impact it has is really helping tip that balance back. How on earth are companies going to manage compliance? Well, they're going to use Gen AI to really start helping them understand, draft, pull everything together, just speed that process up a little bit. It doesn't take away the judgment. It just gives them that little bit of an extra oomph to get through something that's got some pretty heavy deadlines.
I like it. Mandi?
I think it'll be interesting to watch in 2024 the reversal fact. So, like, my first comment was about how internally you would see teams using it. I'm very curious to see externally as more and more stakeholders have access and open access to generative AI, how that changes the game. And sustainability professionals and investor relations professionals, to Andie's point, have been using AI in different ways, portfolio evaluation or ESG risk evaluation. So there's nothing new to the game there to have an external stakeholder play. But what happens when your future employee puts in, and I did this just out of curiosity, like on ChatGPT, like, what is Workiva's position for employees on ESG? And what did they come up with, right? Like, what happens when a stakeholder begins to use it? Steve, you and I talk about, like, what happens when regulators start to use more generative AI. And that is going to be very interesting to watch the ground open up on that in 2024 to help practitioners really start to think about the game-changing nature of then what your disclosures look like, and are they actually feeding into where the stakeholders are scraping.
Well, I love that. And I'm cheating a little bit, but in the opposite way of Andie, because Mandi, I'm actually going to build on yours. I actually feel like the compliance aspect becomes one of the ways that generative AI gets used in really meaningful ways in 2024. And I think that there's an opportunity for financial reporting, as well as ESG teams, as well as audit teams. And Ernest will give you the final word here in just a minute, to actually use generative AI as perhaps some kind of a compliance check. Does this meet the requirements? How are we summarizing the information in ways that are going to meet both the requirements as well as the needs of our stakeholders? That feels like something that generative AI could do today, at least as a start. And I feel like amongst the talent shortages or companies that may not be hiring as much as they would like to, I feel like that's a real value add place where generative AI could be used in the short term. Ernest, we'll give you the final word. How's Gen AI going to rock everybody's world in 2024?
I think generative AI is going to make interns a lot more effective. No, actually, I think Gen AI is really going to rock the regulatory environment, right? Because there's got to be some guidance in terms of ethical use of such technology. I think we saw an instance of it this year where I don't think it was generative AI, but it was AI that was used to produce a song that sounded just like the two artists that it was emulating. And I think it was Drake and The Weeknd, if anybody's familiar with this story. Well, that song actually got leaked out into the public, and it actually hit like a Billboard chart and was very much downloaded, and people thought it was a real thing. But the record labels came back and was able to pull that content out. So regulations in terms of, again, the ethical use, what can they use it for? What should they not be using it for? It's beyond just the applications that we're thinking about from a policy making perspective, or even document and processes. Or what I love about Gen AI is you don't have to start with a blank piece of paper, but to Andie's point, you still need that judgment and that human intervention to make sure that whatever the technology is producing is actually of quality. So I think we're going to see a lot more heightened scrutiny and regulation around the use of generative AI as it pertains to business applications.
Ernest, Andie, and Steve, thank you so much for a lively and thoughtful discussion. I think about all that we talked about, from this idea of how are we going to move beyond regulation, and that includes AI, to the worthy discussion around getting clear about sustainability teams trying to move forward with regulation as well as impact, and how all these groups are going to come together to ultimately build a sustainable world and a sustainable business. This has been a phenomenal show. It's been fun to have an entire season where we all got to host and share a moment in the hot seat as we think about the collide of risk, financial, and sustainability coming together for ultimate impact. And with that, it's an official wrap on Season 2 of ESG Talk, brought to you by Workiva, the world's only unified platform for financial reporting, ESG, audit, and risk. To our listeners, thank you, thank you, thank you for tuning in today and throughout the entire season. Over the next few weeks, we'll be taking a brief hiatus and re-releasing some of our favorite episodes. We'll be combining episodes with similar focus and topics like measuring the ROI and sustainability, and taking a look at how different functions are being impacted by ESG. And then we'll be right back in January for another special episode to kick off, yes, you got it, Season 3. In the meantime, if you enjoyed this episode, please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to see episodes from Season 3 on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Wishing you and your loved ones a happy, healthy, safe holiday season, and we'll talk real soon in the new year.